My full name is Charles Cecil Guyton, Jr., and I was born in Birmingham in 1954. Grew up in the Titusville neighborhood. The part of the neighborhood that I grew up in was pretty middle class. The women in my family, my mother and her sister were both educators, and my grandmother was a missionary worker with the Baptist church and an Avon sales lady. And so, we lived a pretty idyllic life, not a lot of hardships. Yeah, it was pretty middle class and pretty self-contained, and a lot of that had to do with the attitudes of the day, segregation and Jim Crow, so you could pretty much find everything that you wanted right there. My aunt Nadine Williams was actually featured in Four Little Girls in the documentary about Spike Lee. And she was pretty well known in the Titusville area and pretty much accepted. She went to Fisk, her husband went to Morehouse. They were kind of like the elitists of the black community. He worked in the medical center as a medical professional, so they were well known. My mother was pretty well known too, but not like my aunt and uncle. They were socialites. They didn't have any children. They partied like there was no tomorrow, and they just enjoyed life, The world changed when you stepped out of your community. Everything literally was black and white. I remember this hotel in particular because a number of men that I knew that were waiters worked here, but we couldn't stay here. You come downtown and there were colored water fountains and white water fountains. The lunch counters that were upstairs were white only. Most of the restaurants were white only. The back of the bus was the colored section. The front of the bus was the white section. You just expected that. That's the way life was, and it's not the way we wanted life to be, but that's the way life was, Then things really got rough when the bombing campaign started to amp back up in the late 50s. There was an area of Birmingham that's pretty well documented and known as Dynamite Hill. And Arthur Shores, who was a lawyer with the NAACP, he lived on that hill. He lived on Center Street. His house was bombed twice, So bombings were pretty, they weren't rare, let me put it that way. In 1961, I was 7 years old. My mother was very much involved from the very beginning with the civil rights movement, along with my grandmother and my aunt and uncle. She was afraid to allow me, because I was so little, she didn't want me to get hurt. We now know that hurting children was not beyond what they would do. So from the very beginning, my mother wanted to protect me and keep me from being involved. But I would go to meetings with her. I would imagine around 1962 is when things started to be planned. I remember in 1963, Joan Baez came to New Pilgrim Baptist Church, and we went to that program. And I think maybe later on that year, Reverend King gave his sermon, a letter from a Birmingham jail at Ebenezer Baptist Church, and we were invited to go over to Atlanta for that. At 8 years old, I knew that I was like living in history. I had no idea what was on the horizon, the violence that I was gonna have to be witness to. That August was the March on Washington, and once again, my mother didn't allow me to go. My grandmother took my sister, but my mother was afraid for me to go because I was so little. My mother and my grandmother were very close to Reverend Shuttlesworth. When Reverend Shuttlesworth left Birmingham, he moved to Cincinnati and pastored a church there. And it just so happened that the church that he pastored, my grandmother's brother was a senior deacon there. So for years we had been going to Cincinnati and going to that church, and so they knew Reverend Shuttlesworth well. And everybody in Birmingham knew. I mean, what a lot of people don't know is that the driving force behind the Birmingham movement was Fred Shuttlesworth. He was not afraid. He was, you might even say, as the kids say, he had a lot of swag, you know, and he would walk right up to a crowd and didn't care. He wasn't afraid. Some Sundays he would come by the house and have Sunday dinner with us. To me, at 6 or 7 years old, he was just this big guy. He was huge to me, and he had this booming voice. Ironically, the last time I saw Reverend Shuttlesworth was in this hotel. I was back living here. I moved back here in 2005, and I was working in the restaurant, which was then a restaurant called Icon. And I saw him walk into the lobby. And I said, I gotta go talk to him. And a friend of mine was the manager, and she was like, you can't. And I'm like, look, you can fire me, but I'm going to talk to him. And we sat right there in the lobby, and we talked for about 15 or 20 minutes. And he told me, he said, I first thanked him because I think we all learned courage from him. And then I told him who I was, and he remembered my mother and my grandmother. And then he told me, he said, they all rolling over in their graves. Bull and George, he said, we beat them. We beat them all. That was the defiant attitude that he had, and I think he was kind of like a mix of both Martin and Malcolm X, that by any means necessary without the assault weapon, but he wasn't gonna back down. Condoleezza Rice grew up in Titusville. I guess you could say she was very withdrawn. She was quiet. There were only a few kids that probably had the opportunity to play with her, to get to know her. We were two, Vanessa Hunter and her brother George III were two more. There was a few other kids in the little subdivision that they lived in, which was just south of 6th Avenue. We all knew her pretty well, but she left. They moved to Denver when she was about 12 or 13, and I've never seen her since. But she comes back a lot. I have a lot of friends that are still friends with her today. I'm quite sure if she heard my name, she'd remember me because that's how close our families were. I went to Center Street Elementary School, and that September, I was all excited because my teacher was going to be Denise McNair. And her and her husband Chris were very close to my family, and I just adored Maxine. She was so pretty, and she could sing like a bird. And her and my mother were like the best of friends. Chris and his brother was our milkman. I was real close to the McNair family, and even to Maxine's mother and father and her sister. Mother and father were the Pippins, and her sister, Juanita Jones. And Juanita had a daughter by the name of Lynn. We all played together. My grandparents lived about 2 blocks away from them. The Pippins lived directly across the street from Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is where Condoleezza Rice's father was pastor, And so we all played together. We went to Vacation Bible School at Westminster. My aunt, who was a music teacher, and she's featured in the documentary about Spike Lee, she would have her piano recital at that church every year. So we were close to, the Rices, and the families in Titusville at that time. They were close-knit in such a way because the adults knew the potential for violence. And they also wanted us to have a normal life, and so, and they pretty much pulled that off. If the bombing had never happened, they would have pulled it off. Reverend Rice's church was on 6th Avenue, right off of Center Street, in between Center Street and Center Way. And my grandmother lived right off of Center Street and 6th Avenue, and so did the Pippins. The Pippins lived on 6th Avenue. And so that was the church for that part of the neighborhood, you know, because Reverend Rice was this gentle giant that everybody respected. And so that's where the kids in that part of the neighborhood would go. And there was a library on the corner. So we would go there for vacation Bible school for spring break and in the summer. Of course, it was more like it was a safe place for us to go then, and the church was providing that. And the premise behind it was they were going to be teaching us Bible verses. But in reality, what it was it was for our safety. You know, I told another reporter once that our parents probably pulled off the best play that was ever produced in the city of Birmingham. And that is that they had us convinced that our lives were normal, because we did everything that any other kid in any other part of the country did, but we did it all like in Titusville, you know. And you never knew until you went outside of Titusville what the rest of the world was like. But Titusville was normal. You know, we went to the grocery store, we went to the pharmacy, we went to the movies, you know. Of course, we would have to come downtown for the movies. The movies were on 4th Avenue, but everything that we needed was in the black area, you know, and that's where we pretty much conducted our lives. And our parents pulled it off, you know. You know, if not for the bombing, they would have pulled it off 100%, you know. I was all excited about Maxine being my teacher, and we started the school year. And probably that Friday, we probably all walked home from school together. The Jefferson children, who were the children of Dr. Bernard Jefferson, who was a local dentist, they lived on the other corner across from the Pippins, right in front of the church. And so we would all walk home together. William Bell, who ended up being mayor of Birmingham, he was our crossing guard, because he was an older kid. And his brother Michael, we all lived north of the school, you know, and so we would walk straight down Center Street to the 6th Avenue Center Street area, which is where all of us would end up going. So I would imagine that Friday I walked home from school with Denise, not knowing that that was the last time that I was going to see her, you know. And then that Sunday, we didn't go to church. We went to 6th Avenue Baptist Church, which at that time was located where Cooper Green Hospital is now located. And we didn't go to church that Sunday, and I was outside throwing my football up in the air. I think my mother must have been in the house cooking when we heard the explosion. And even with Titusville being as far away from the downtown area as it was, it shook our house, you know. And of course, we knew what it was, because we heard explosions all the time, you know. We didn't know it was 16th Street. And I guess maybe an hour or so later, someone called my mother to tell her that the church had been bombed. And maybe an hour or so after that, we received a phone call that Denise had been killed, you know. I don't even remember how I reacted, because we went to school the next day, you know. I know that 40 years later, I still wasn't over it. I know today I'm still not over it, you know. You know, Denise was such a nice, pretty little girl, you know, and she would be 71 years old now. And I often think about what her life might have been, you know. I know she loved photography, and she adored my sister. She would sometimes even spend the night at our house, because my sister was 3 years older than her, and I was 3 years younger. So we were kind of like her little brother, big sister, you know, because the McNairs didn't have any other children at that time. Yeah, and so we went back to school, and Maxine never came back. And it probably was 5 years later before I saw her again because she just withdrew. I would see Chris all the time, you know. And, you know, it was something that, you know, evil concocted. You know, to think that some men can sit somewhere and plan to bomb a church in their community with people just like them. Only difference is the color of their skin. You know, that hate would be so strong that the powers to be would not even investigate it the way it should have been investigated. For 10 years, nobody did nothing. You know, thanks to Bill Baxley, who risked his career to bring Robert Chambliss to trial and conviction, you know. So it's a difficult thing. It's not hard for me to talk about because it is part of my life. It caused a lot of pain in my life, and I think it was the day that I lost my innocence, and also probably was the day that I lost my way. You know, and it took me 30 years to find my way back. She was bubbly, she was a girly girl. She wanted to do everything that my sister Sharon did. She followed Sharon around like she was a little puppy dog. And, you know, if Sharon had a certain color ribbon in her hair, Denise wanted that color too, you know, and she loved other kids. She was a sweet girl. Nobody disliked Denise, everybody loved her. And that was one of the painful things for me because, you know, I didn't think that everybody loved me. And she died and I didn't, you know, and she was this good kid and maybe I wasn't so good. You know, it's just the thoughts that an 8-year-old boy has. By the time I was in my 20s, I was using drugs. By the time I was in my late 20s, I was addicted to crack. Yeah. I got clean in 1993, 30 years ago. You know, strongest thing I probably drink is tea today. But that's because I don't ever want to go back to being that person again that I was. God has presented a new life to me, you know, a better way for me to live, you know. I also get a chance to reach out to other people to tell them that no matter what it is that you're saddled with, that whatever addiction you may have, it doesn't have to be permanent, that there's a way out, you know. It took me 30 years to find my way out, but I've been here for 30 more years. I knew Cynthia Wesley. I didn't know her well. That same aunt that I was saying that was the music teacher, she, at the time of the bombing, she taught at Lewis Elementary School, which is where Cynthia's father was principal. So when they would have birthday parties for Cynthia, you know, we would go, you know, and Cynthia took piano lessons from my aunt also. And so she would be a part of the recitals that my aunt would have. But I didn't know her like I knew Denise. You know, they were all much older than me. You know, they were older than Denise. The three of them were 14. Denise was 11. And we didn't go to 16th Street, even though I knew Reverend Cross well. Reverend Cross lived in our neighborhood. He was the pastor at that time. The other two I didn't know. The funeral was at our church, 6th Avenue Baptist Church. And mostly what I remember about it was the massive crowds that were outside. I remember Reverend King's eulogy to some degree. But once again, you know, I was 8 years old. I think my emotions and the size of the moment couldn't let me focus. But I was there. I can remember press being there from every part of the world, you know, from Europe, from Asia, you name it. I also remember how distraught my sister was. My nephew recently found a picture at the African American Museum of History and Culture in DC, And it's a picture of my sister, who, like I say, was 3 years older than Denise, and my aunt, who was the music teacher, and another woman, and they were helping my sister down the steps because she was so distraught. You know, I remember my dad sometimes after that finding some foreign newspaper where they had a picture of my sister on the front page and described her as Denise's sister. But that's how distraught Sharon was. She loved it. I mean, Denise was a part of our family, you know, and all intents and purposes, it's like, you know, she was like a sister to us. It wasn't like a casual relationship. It was a very close and family type relationship. You know, we went to her birthday parties. We played with her, you know, and she had sleepovers with my sister, you know, and, you know, we missed her immediately. It tore out a piece of our hearts, you know, and I think for that reason, it's taken me so long to have closure that I still don't have total closure today. You know, I got some measure of closure when Bobby Frank Cherry and Herman Cash were convicted, but not enough to end the memory or to make the memory. I don't think you can make the memory anything more than what it was. It was a tragic incident, and you know, why should we totally get over it? You know. Pastor Joseph Ellwanger. Wow. I went to St. Paul Lutheran kindergarten under Pastor Ellwanger. A few years ago, probably about 20 years ago, I was reading an article about a Lutheran priest in Milwaukee that was just doing great things in the recovering community. It kind of piqued my interest because I was in recovery. And when I read his name, it said Joseph Ellwanger. And so I called around and got his phone number and finally talked to him on the phone. And I went to Milwaukee and we had dinner, you know, and he didn't remember me, but, you know, of course, we were little kids at the time. When I left St. Paul's and went to elementary school, I was 6 years old. So he hadn't seen me since I was 6. But he and Chris McNair remained friends. The next time that I saw him after that trip to Milwaukee was at Chris's 90th birthday party. And then, of course, I saw him at Chris's funeral. I haven't seen him since Chris's funeral. You know, he was another very brave man. They lived in our community. They lived in Titusville. His kids went to Washington Elementary School. A lot of people don't know that the first school that was integrated in the city of Birmingham was not integrated by some black kids. It was integrated by some white kids, and they were his. You know, they lived right down the street from the church, right off of 1st Street and 6th Avenue. I think a lot of people thought he was crazy, that he couldn't have good sense because, you know, he was a target, but he didn't care. You know, when you're on the side of righteousness and right, that's a powerful weapon. It's more powerful than any gun could ever be, more powerful than any bomb. I mean, it's evident by, you know, 16th Street being bombed 60 years ago. It's still here and the Klan's not. So, which institution was better? So. I never had any personal encounters with the Klan, although I was well aware that they were here. You know, children are afraid of the boogeyman, but they don't know who the boogeyman is. And I kind of knew who the boogeyman was. It was Robert Shelton, and he'd be on the TV almost weekly, spewing hate. So I knew that they were there. But because of the way our families protected us, we didn't come face to face with any of that. I'm quite sure other members of my family did. You know, I didn't know about Emmett Till until I was a teenager. No Jet magazines or articles about Emmett Till were ever in my house. And I think that was on purpose, that they didn't want me to know because they didn't want me to be afraid. There was enough to be afraid of. They wanted me to have a normal childhood. And how could you, if you saw another little boy that looked like you, and this is what they did to him, you know? I never even addressed my mother about it. I immediately understood why. I didn't know, you know? It was too grotesque. I remember when I was about 5 years old, there was a liquor store on 6th Avenue in Titusville. It was maybe 2 blocks west of where the city jail is. And a lot of drunks would hang out around the liquor store begging for money. And I imagine this guy, I'm not certain if he was one of those guys, but he had walked out in the middle of the street and a car had hit him. And someone called an ambulance. But the ambulance that came was the white ambulance. Now the hospital is about a mile down the street, straight down 6th Avenue. The ambulance service refused to take him. They had to call the black service, which was run by A.G. Gaston. It was one of his enterprises. And by the time that ambulance service got there, he had expired. And so I knew that there was this very distinct hate that had nothing to do with the person. It had all to do with the color of his skin, you know. So you go through life even as a child and you realize that there are these fingers pointing at you, and at any minute, one of those fingers could harm you, you know, because the signs were everywhere. The things we couldn't do, you know, and you had to know that you couldn't go here, you couldn't go there, you couldn't go to this park, you couldn't go to that park. You know, you couldn't question what a policeman asked you to do, you know. So from that standpoint, I had a complete understanding. But as far as having any direct contact with any of that, it didn't hit home until Denise was killed, you know. It all stemmed from the Supreme Court case of Plessy versus Ferguson. And it's separate but equal. I don't know how equal it was, but everything that you can think of about life was separated. Everything. It just wasn't one or two things. It was everything. You know, it was church, it was school, it was hospitalizations, you know, where you could go to have birth, to give births, restaurants, you name it. We would travel back and forth to Chicago a lot because my father's family lived in Chicago and my mother had a brother. And I remember when we first started going, we would go by car. Eventually we started going by train. But until we reached the Ohio River, my mother and my sister couldn't use the bathroom because no service station would allow them to do that. They would have to go in the woods to use the bathroom, you know. It was demoralizing, you know, that another human being would treat other human beings in such a way to not only show that there was a difference, but that difference meant that we hate you, you know. So that part was difficult because you wanted to ask, why do you hate me so much, you know? There was a time in my life when I started to hate, you know. I started to hate white people, and eventually I hated my father. But I tell you something about hate. It doesn't do anything to the object of your hate. It does it to you. You know, and I knew that if I didn't dispel that hate from my spirit, that it would eat me up. You know, and I think that helped me to get relief and eventually get clean. For a long time, I hated my father. It was like a love-hate relationship. I thought my father had left because of me. I thought that what he had done or had not done for us was wrong. And I had to just come to the realization that whatever happened between him and my mother was between them and not me. You know, that at some point my mother was probably equally as much to blame as he was, you know. But that took logic, and sometimes youth doesn't give you a whole lot of logic. So when I was a little boy, I thought that I didn't belong to my family because I was so much darker than my mother, father, and sister. And that the reason why my dad left was because I was from somewhere else. And so in my daydreams, I found another figure to be my father. And I was looking through the pages of Ebony magazine, and I saw this very distinguished, dark black man dressed in an Italian suit with his right hand in his pocket. And it was John H. Johnson, who was the founder and publisher of Ebony magazine. Some years later, I ended up working for him. You know, and before he died, I never told him that I had chose him to be my dad. But even to this day, I still work with his daughter, Linda. And I was with her at the first inauguration of Barack Obama. And you know, I told her that her father was probably as equally responsible for us reaching this point as the civil rights movement was, because not only had he displayed black life in the pages of Ebony and Jet, he probably contributed more money than anybody else, you know. And so we stood on the backs of men like him, you know. And I told her about how I had picked him to be my dad when, as a little boy, I was, you know, going through pain. Because in the South, even back then, there was a distinction in the black community between dark black people and light-skinned black people. You know, light-skinned black people were considered to be better, smarter, prettier. I was black with nappy hair, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I thought I wasn't good. Because, you know, you didn't see little black kids on the Ivory commercial with nappy hair, and that was two shades darker than everybody else. You didn't see that. Matter of fact, you didn't see any black people, but when you did, they didn't look like me, you know. So there was a degree of self-hatred there. And I think, you know, drinking and doing drugs was a way of masking how I felt, you know, the pain that life had presented to me. No, I'm not making excuses, because I'm responsible for anything that I picked up as an adult and started to do. But there's reasons behind it. You know, I just had to find a reason to get out of it. And thankfully I did. In the black community, there was always a division. You know, there were blacks who could pass for white, and then there were light-skinned blacks, and then there were dark blacks. And it was very distinctive. The whites that could pass actually lived as white people if they wanted to. I had a cousin who was married to a woman, and her family was very light. And she had a brother. I'll never forget the first time I met him. He even had a southern drawl. And he had a black wife, a dark black wife. And my first thought was, who is this white man that's married to this black woman that's in Alabama in 1964, you know? But he was black. And so, you know, you can't blame black people that were able to pass, because living as a white person in America, even to this day, you know, you have a better chance at a whole lot of stuff than if you live as a black person. You know, the other thing was black people who were light-skinned were very well accepted by the whole black community. The light-skinned kids with the good hair, they were the ones that everybody, the girls liked, everybody wanted to emulate. They were the stars. You know, if the girl brought home the dark-skinned boy, the dad wasn't gonna like that much. But if she brought home the cute, curly-haired black kid, he could stay. And that's just how I felt. You know, it may not have been completely like that, but that was what I got from my experiences growing up. That the black kids, the really black kids, were not very well accepted. Dark-skinned men didn't become popular until Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan's emergence on the sporting scene of the NBA is what changed all that. It even changed for even bald-headed men. Being bald was not very popular before him either. So that's the effect that one individual had on society culture. Even until he died, my father didn't need a map. He had driven just about every highway in the United States. I was coming back from the second inauguration of Barack Obama, and my car broke down someplace in between Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Maryland. And I had to stay overnight because it was right at closing time when I was able to get my car to a garage, and they were like, well, we can fix it, but it'll be tomorrow. You're gonna have to get a hotel room. So I get a cab, I go to a hotel room, and I call my dad on the phone and tell him what happened. And he said, well, where are you? I said, well, I'm someplace, I think it's called Clinton, Maryland. And he was like, yeah, I know where that is. That's near Breezewood. And I'm like, I don't know, Dad. I didn't see anything that said Breezewood. Yeah, he said, yeah, it's somewhere near Breezewood, guarantee you. Now, at this time, my dad was probably 92, 93 years old in a nursing home. So I wasn't going to take his word on that. But next day, I get my car, drive 2 miles down the highway, and I see a sign that says Breezewood. So he knew. He knew because he had been there so many times. So I don't think my dad probably had to even use a green book. He probably knew all those places because he had stopped there so many times. I mean, back then airline travel was not very big for anybody, especially if you were black. And if you drove the highways, you had to know where you could stop and where you couldn't stop. It was detrimental if you didn't know. But when we would travel with just my mother, we would ride the train. And we get the train right downtown Birmingham. It was called a Hummingbird. And the Hummingbird would take us to Chicago. And starting out, black people sat on one side of the train car, white people sat on the other side, and they pulled a curtain down the middle of the train car. And then when you crossed the Ohio River, they removed the curtains, and now you could be one. And that was probably my first experiences of playing with white kids, was on that train. But my mother would take us to Chicago every summer just to get us out of Birmingham. And so Chicago was like a mecca because all the things we couldn't do here, we could do there. We could go to the amusement parks, and to the zoo, to the museums. We could do all of that. I remember the first time I went to the Science and Industry Museum in Chicago, I was just amazed that this world existed, and we could go to the beach. I'm very proud to be from Birmingham. I think Birmingham has transcended and overcome. And even though we can't erase our ugly history, I think we've changed for the better. I think being from Birmingham strikes a chord in everybody, and I don't care where I go and I say I'm from Birmingham, they know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not like being from, Middletown, Ohio, or somewhere in Iowa, or somewhere even in the middle of Texas. Birmingham has a distinct mark, and good or bad, that people understand. So if you survive Birmingham, you must be a survivor. I'm proud that Birmingham is where it is today. I remember, like I said, there was no way I could be having this conversation with you in this hotel, the Tutwiler Hotel. There's a hotel down the street called the Redmont. It's right down the street. And I worked there briefly back in the 80s, early 90s. And one of my dad's brothers came to town, and I got him a room there. And the room happened to be a suite because we got a discount. And I remember him crying, telling me that he never envisioned himself being able to stay in that hotel because when he was a little boy, he would shine shoes outside the front for a quarter. And times had changed where he was actually in that hotel. and this meant a lot to him, you know. Whereas it may not have meant a whole lot to some white guy that was his age, you know. I mean, when you live in a world that's diametrically opposed to your well-being and your existence, to finally get recognition is big. In 2005, I moved back here for a few years, and one of the jobs that I had here was working in the restaurant. Well, I first started working running the room service, and I'm an experienced food server, and they saw that right away and eventually brought me upstairs. But I actually developed a lot of friendships that I'm still very close to. Matter of fact, one couple that worked here, they weren't together when we worked here, but they eventually got married. I just left northern Quebec with them. You know, we were, and I had never been to Quebec before, you know, but we were in a place called Saint Marguerite du Lac Maison. And it was beautiful. It was a beautiful experience, you know, and we're still real close to this day. So actually I saw him last weekend too, and they live in Milwaukee, you know, so. There were lots of steel plants. I would imagine that a lot of us have had health issues and are gonna have health issues because of the air quality that existed in Birmingham back then. Of course, nobody cared about global warming or pollution at that time. Thankfully, probably because of UAB, the city didn't have to depend on the mills anymore, you know. And UAB was very responsible with desegregating Birmingham. Just goes to show you the smarter you are, the wiser you are. So, you know, those educators that, you know, and on another note, my uncle, Bernard Williams, when he passed away, the prior dean of the medical school, Dr. James Pittman, gave part of his eulogy. And what Dr. Pittman said was that my uncle probably had been the first African American to teach at a major white institution in all of the Southeast. He started teaching in the medical school at the University of Alabama in Birmingham in 1967. He started out with a medical degree working in the animal lab in 1953. Dr. Pittman he was part of my youth growing up. He and my uncle were very close. He brought my uncle into the medical center, and they remained close until my uncle's death. He was a different guy for his time. You know, he was not from this region, so he didn't live by its rules, and he wasn't gonna let it determine how he lived. He was married to an Asian woman, and there were a number of African Americans that he brought onto his staff at UAB. He didn't hire them because they were black or because they were white or because they were Asian. He hired them because they were smart. It's strange how a people would think that because of the color of your skin that it limited your intellect. Black men couldn't play quarterback because they weren't smart enough. You know, we couldn't be astronauts because we weren't smart enough. How do you tie intellect to skin color? I think if you do that, that proves just how ignorant you are, you know.